Hey there. Tonight we're going back, not to kingdoms or empires, but to something far more profound. We're tracing the entire evolutionary journey that made us human. From our earliest primate ancestors swinging through ancient forests to the moment our species first looked up at the stars and wondered why we were here, this isn't just about bones and fossils. It's about the incredible series of accidents, adaptations, and survival stories that led to you sitting here right now, listening to these words. If this kind of deep dive into our origins helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely humbling about knowing we're all here together, descendants of the same ancient journey, falling asleep to the story of how we came to be. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin at the very beginning. Long before there were humans, before there were even apes, there were small, furry creatures scurrying through the canopy of primordial forests. Picture a world 60 million years ago. The dinosaurs are gone, wiped out by catastrophe, and mammals are beginning to claim the earth. In this warm, humid world, covered in dense forests, tiny tree-dwelling creatures are developing something remarkable: hands that can grasp, eyes that can see in color, and brains that are slowly, almost imperceptibly, growing larger. These were our earliest primate ancestors, creatures like Plesiodapis in North America and Archicebus in China, no bigger than a modern squirrel, but carrying within their genes the blueprint for everything we would become. They didn't know they were special. They were just trying to survive, leaping from branch to branch, searching for fruit and insects, avoiding predators in a world that was constantly trying to kill them. But something was happening in their evolution that would change everything. While most mammals were content with basic black and white vision, these early primates were developing something extraordinary: the ability to see the world in full color. It seems simple now, but imagine the advantage. Suddenly, ripe red fruit could be distinguished from green leaves. Yellow flowers stood out against brown bark. The world exploded into a rainbow of survival opportunities. This wasn't just luck. Evolution was crafting these creatures for a life in the trees, where depth perception meant the difference between a successful leap and a fatal fall. Their eyes moved to the front of their heads, giving them binocular vision. Their hands developed opposable thumbs, allowing them to grip branches with precision. And most importantly, their brains began to expand, processing this flood of visual information and spatial complexity. For millions of years, these early primates thrived in their arboreal paradise. They spread across the continents, adapting to different environments, developing into various species. But they remained fundamentally similar: small, tree-dwelling creatures living relatively simple lives. The world was stable, warm, and forested. There was no pressure to change, no reason to evolve beyond their successful formula. Then, around 7 million years ago, everything changed. In Africa, the climate began to shift. The lush forests that had covered the continent for millions of years started to shrink. Grasslands expanded. Trees became scattered islands in a sea of savanna. For most forest-dwelling creatures, this was a catastrophe. But for one particular group of primates, it became an opportunity that would transform the history of life on Earth. These weren't yet human, but they were becoming something new. Sahelanthropus chadensis, a creature we know from fragmentary fossils found in Chad, lived at this crucial moment 7 million years ago. Its skull tells an extraordinary story. The brain was still small, ape-sized, but something fundamental had changed. The foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord connects to the skull, had moved. This tiny shift in anatomy represented a revolution in how these creatures held themselves in the world. They were beginning to stand upright. Imagine what this meant. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, a primate was regularly balancing on just 2 legs, freeing its hands from the burden of locomotion. This wasn't a sudden transformation. These early hominins still spent time in trees, still moved on all 4s when it suited them, but increasingly, they were experimenting with this new way of moving through the world. Walking upright in the shrinking forests and expanding grasslands wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about survival in a changing world. Standing tall allowed them to see over tall grass, to spot predators and prey from a distance. It allowed them to carry things, food, tools, infants, across long distances. And perhaps most importantly, it freed their hands to manipulate their environment in ways no creature had ever done before. The fossil record from this period is frustratingly sparse. We catch glimpses of these early experiments in upright walking through scattered bones and teeth, but the full story remains tantalizingly incomplete. What we do know is that multiple species were trying different solutions to the same environmental pressures. Some remained in the trees, some adapted to life on the ground, but kept their ape-like proportions. And some, the ones that would eventually lead to us, committed fully to this strange new way of moving through the world. Aurorin tugenensis, living 6 million years ago in what is now Kenya, represents another crucial step in this journey. Its leg bones show clear adaptations for upright walking, while its arms retained the long proportions useful for climbing. This was a creature caught between 2 worlds, equally at home in the trees and on the ground, perfectly adapted for a landscape that was itself in transition. But it was Ardipithecus ramidus, living 4.4 million years ago in Ethiopia, that truly revealed the complexity of this evolutionary experiment. When scientists first discovered Ardi, they expected to find something chimpanzee-like, something that would fit neatly into our preconceived notions about human evolution. What they found instead shattered those assumptions completely. Ardi wasn't a knuckle-walking forest dweller like modern chimpanzees. She wasn't even particularly chimpanzee-like at all. Instead, she represented something entirely unique, a creature that had evolved its own solution to the challenge of living in a changing world. She could walk upright on the ground, but her feet retained the flexibility needed for climbing. She could move through trees, but her pelvis showed adaptations for bipedal locomotion. She was, in every sense, a transitional form, perfectly adapted for a world that was itself in transition. This discovery forced scientists to completely reconsider what the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees actually looked like. For decades, they had assumed it must have been very similar to modern chimpanzees. But Ardi showed that this wasn't the case at all. The ancestor we shared with chimpanzees was probably nothing like either species living today. Evolution had taken both lineages on their own unique journeys, with chimpanzees becoming specialized for life in dense forests, while our lineage was experimenting with something entirely new. The implications of this realization were staggering. It meant that the traits we consider uniquely human, upright walking, tool use, complex social behaviors, weren't deviations from some chimpanzee-like ancestor. They were part of a completely separate evolutionary trajectory that had been unfolding for millions of years. We weren't modified chimpanzees. We were something else entirely. Something that had been developing its own unique characteristics from the very beginning of our separate evolutionary journey. As the climate continued to change and the forests continued to shrink, these early upright walkers faced new challenges. The safety of the trees was no longer guaranteed. Food sources that had been reliable for millions of years were disappearing. Predators that had never been a serious threat in the forest canopy were now constant dangers on the open ground. Many species didn't survive these challenges. But those that did were forced to become something extraordinary. They had to become more than just upright apes. They had to become problem solvers, innovators, creatures capable of adapting not just their bodies, but their behavior to rapidly changing circumstances. They had to learn to work together in ways their ancestors never had, to communicate more effectively, to plan for an uncertain future. They were, without knowing it, taking the first steps on the long journey toward becoming human. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of life on Earth. These early upright walkers, scattered across the changing landscapes of Africa, were about to embark on an evolutionary journey that would produce larger brains, more sophisticated tools, complex language, art, music, science, and eventually, the ability to leave their home planet and explore the cosmos itself. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It took millions of years, countless generations, and a series of evolutionary experiments that would make some species extinct while others thrived. The creatures that would eventually become us had to survive ice ages and volcanic eruptions, droughts and floods, predators and diseases. They had to compete with other human species, some of whom were stronger, faster, or better adapted to specific environments. The story of how they not only survived but eventually came to dominate the planet is one of the most remarkable tales in the history of life itself. And it all began with those first tentative steps away from the safety of the trees, into an uncertain future that would eventually lead to us sitting here together, sharing this ancient story across time and space. By 4 million years ago, a new chapter in our story was beginning to unfold across the African landscape. The climate had continued its relentless shift, and the creatures that had survived the transition from forest to savanna were becoming something unprecedented. They were developing into Australopithecus, a genus that would bridge the gap between our ape-like ancestors and the beings we would eventually become. Picture Lucy, that famous fossil discovered in the Ethiopian highlands, walking across ancient floodplains 3.2 million years ago. She stood just over 3 feet tall, with arms that still hung long at her sides and a brain no larger than a modern chimpanzee's. But when she moved across the landscape, she did so on 2 legs, with a stride that was unmistakably, definitively human. Her footsteps pressed into volcanic ash that would preserve them for millennia, creating a trail that tells us more about our origins than almost any other discovery. Lucy wasn't alone. Across eastern and southern Africa, various species of Australopithecus were experimenting with this new way of being in the world. Some were robust, with massive jaws and powerful muscles for processing tough plant materials. Others were more gracile, with smaller teeth and lighter builds. They were like different drafts of the same evolutionary essay, each trying to solve the puzzle of survival in a world that demanded both flexibility and specialization. These weren't the bumbling half-apes that popular culture sometimes portrays. They were sophisticated survivors who had mastered their environments in ways we're only beginning to understand. They lived in complex social groups, caring for their young for extended periods, and likely developing the first rudimentary forms of what we might recognize as culture. They used tools, simple ones fashioned from stone and bone, but tools nonetheless. They planned ahead, carrying useful objects across long distances. They communicated with each other in ways that went beyond simple calls and gestures. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to think differently about their world. Their brains, while still small by modern standards, were growing larger and more complex with each passing generation. Neural pathways that had never existed before were forming, creating new possibilities for processing information, solving problems, and imagining futures that didn't yet exist. The landscape they inhabited was nothing like the Africa we know today. It was a place of constant change, where lakes appeared and disappeared with the shifting climate, where forests gave way to grasslands and then back to woodlands again. Volcanoes erupted regularly, covering the land in ash and creating new geological formations. Rivers changed course, carving new valleys and leaving old ones dry. It was a world that demanded adaptability above all else. And these early hominins were becoming masters of adaptation. When their preferred foods became scarce, they learned to exploit new resources. When predators threatened, they developed new strategies for defense and evasion. When the climate shifted, they adjusted their behavior and their habitat use accordingly. They were, in essence, learning to be human in the most fundamental sense, learning to survive through intelligence and cooperation, rather than through brute strength or specialized physical adaptations. Around 2.8 million years ago, something extraordinary happened in the fossil record. New teeth began appearing alongside those of Australopithecus. Teeth that belonged to something different, something that would eventually be recognized as our own genus. Homo had arrived, though these early representatives were still very much works in progress, experiments in a new kind of existence. These early members of our genus were different from their Australopithecine cousins in subtle but crucial ways. Their teeth were smaller, suggesting a shift in diet that would have profound implications for their development. Their brains, while still modest by modern standards, were noticeably larger and more complex. Most importantly, they were developing a relationship with tools that went far beyond anything seen before in the natural world. Homo habilis, the handy person, earned its name for good reason. The stone tools found near their fossils weren't just opportunistically used rocks. They were carefully crafted implements, shaped with purpose and foresight. Creating these tools required an understanding of physics and materials that seems almost miraculous when you consider the brain capacity involved. They had to envision the finished tool before it existed, plan the sequence of strikes needed to create it, and execute that plan with precision. This wasn't just tool use anymore. This was technology, the deliberate modification of the environment to serve specific purposes. And once this threshold was crossed, there was no going back. Each generation of toolmakers could build on the innovations of the previous one, leading to increasingly sophisticated implements and techniques. Culture was becoming cumulative. Knowledge was being preserved and transmitted across generations in ways that no other species had ever achieved. But the most dramatic changes were happening inside their skulls. The human brain was beginning its extraordinary expansion, growing not just in size, but in complexity and organization. New regions were developing that would eventually give rise to language, abstract thought, and the ability to manipulate symbols in sophisticated ways. Neural networks were forming that would allow for planning on timescales that extended far beyond immediate needs. This growth came at a tremendous cost. Larger brains required more energy, forcing changes in diet and behavior that rippled through every aspect of their lives. They needed more protein, more fat, more calories than their plant-eating ancestors. This drove them to become more effective hunters and scavengers, to develop new strategies for obtaining and processing meat. It also meant that their young were born increasingly helpless, with brains too large for fully developed skulls, requiring extended periods of care and protection. These challenges fostered the evolution of increasingly complex social structures. Raising such dependent offspring required cooperation on a scale never seen before in the primate world. Adults had to work together to gather food, protect the group, and care for the young. This cooperation wasn't just instinctual anymore. It was planned, negotiated, and maintained through increasingly sophisticated forms of communication. By 1.8 million years ago, these evolutionary experiments had produced something truly remarkable: Homo erectus, the first of our ancestors to look genuinely human. Tall and lean, with limbs proportioned much like our own, they were built for efficiency and endurance rather than raw power. Their brains had grown to nearly twice the size of their Australopithecine ancestors, and they had mastered fire, that most transformative of all technologies. Fire changed everything. It extended the day, allowing for activities after dark that had never been possible before. It transformed food, making tough plants digestible and unlocking nutrients that had previously been inaccessible. It provided warmth and protection, enabling these early humans to expand into environments that would have been uninhabitable without it. Most importantly, it created a focal point for social activity, a gathering place where stories could be shared, knowledge transmitted, and the bonds of community strengthened. With fire in their control, Homo erectus became the first of our ancestors to leave Africa. This wasn't a single dramatic migration, but rather a gradual expansion that took place over hundreds of thousands of years. Small groups pushed into new territories, following rivers and coastlines, adapting to new climates and environments. They reached the Middle East, then Asia, eventually spreading as far as China and Indonesia. They were the first truly global human species, and their success was unprecedented. These migrations weren't just about finding new hunting grounds or escaping competition. They represented something fundamentally new in the history of life on Earth, the conscious exploration of the world by creatures capable of adapting their behavior faster than their genes could evolve. They didn't wait for natural selection to equip them with thick fur for cold climates or specialized digestive systems for new foods. Instead, they invented clothing, shelter, and cooking techniques that allowed them to thrive in environments for which they weren't physically adapted. This behavioral flexibility became the defining characteristic of human evolution. While other species were locked into specific ecological niches by their anatomy and instincts, humans were learning to remake themselves and their environments to suit their needs. They were becoming the first truly adaptable species, capable of thriving in deserts and tundra, mountains and coastal plains, forests and grasslands. But success came with its own challenges. As human populations spread and grew, they encountered new diseases, new predators, and new environmental hazards. They had to learn to navigate complex social relationships within increasingly large groups. Competition for resources intensified, leading to conflicts that required new forms of organization and leadership. The very success of the human experiment was creating pressures that would drive further evolution, both biological and cultural. The stage was set for the next great leap in human development. The emergence of even larger brains, more sophisticated tools, and the first glimmerings of the symbolic thought that would eventually give rise to language, art, and the capacity for abstract reasoning that defines modern human consciousness. The migrations of Homo erectus weren't just about survival anymore. They were about something deeper, something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth. For the first time, a species was actively reshaping the world around it, not through millions of years of gradual adaptation, but through ingenuity, cooperation, and an almost reckless willingness to push into the unknown. But even as these early humans spread across continents, evolution wasn't finished with them. Back in Africa, new experiments were taking shape, new variations on the human theme that would push the boundaries of what it meant to be conscious, creative, and capable of imagining worlds that didn't yet exist. Around 700,000 years ago, a new player entered the evolutionary stage. Homo heidelbergensis emerged from the crucible of African evolution with brains that had grown even larger, tools that were more sophisticated, and hunting strategies that bordered on the miraculous. These weren't just scavengers picking at the remains of other predators' kills. They were active hunters, capable of bringing down massive animals through coordination, planning, and the kind of strategic thinking that would make a modern military commander proud. Picture them moving across the landscape in organized groups, their minds constantly calculating, predicting, adapting. They could track prey for days, reading signs in the earth that told stories of where animals had been and where they might be going. They could work together to drive herds toward cliffs or bog grounds, where the massive creatures could be more easily killed. They were thinking not just in the present moment, but projecting their consciousness forward and backward in time, learning from past hunts and planning for future ones. Their tools reflected this growing sophistication. The crude choppers and scrapers of their ancestors gave way to elegant, symmetrical hand axes that were works of art as much as implements of survival. Creating these tools required a mental template, a perfect image held in the mind that guided every strike of stone against stone. The maker had to envision the finished product before beginning, plan the sequence of removals needed to achieve it, and execute that plan with precision that would be impressive even today. But perhaps more remarkably, these hand axes were far more refined than they needed to be for purely practical purposes. The symmetry, the careful shaping, the attention to aesthetic detail, all of this suggests that something new was emerging in the human mind. Beauty was becoming important. Form was beginning to matter as much as function. The seeds of art, of the human drive to create something meaningful and lasting, were already being planted in these ancient workshops. As Homo heidelbergensis populations grew and spread, they encountered the same pressures that had driven previous evolutionary leaps. Competition for resources intensified. Climate continued to shift unpredictably. New diseases emerged as humans came into contact with different animal populations. But instead of simply adapting or dying out, these early humans did something unprecedented. They began to consciously modify their environment on a scale never before seen in the history of life. They controlled fire not just for warmth and cooking, but as a tool for landscape management. They burned forests to create clearings that would attract game animals. They used fire to drive prey, to clear travel routes, to modify entire ecosystems to better serve their needs. For the first time, a single species was becoming a geological force, capable of altering the face of the Earth through conscious, deliberate action. This environmental manipulation had profound effects on their own evolution. As they modified landscapes to support larger game populations, they gained access to more reliable protein sources, which fueled further brain growth. As they learned to plan and execute complex group hunts, they developed increasingly sophisticated forms of communication. The pressures of coordination and cooperation were driving the evolution of cognitive abilities that would eventually give rise to language, mathematics, and abstract reasoning. Around 400,000 years ago, these evolutionary experiments began to branch in different directions. Some populations, pushed by climate change and competition into the harsh environments of Europe and Western Asia, evolved into the Neanderthals. Others, adapting to the unique challenges of Asian environments, became the mysterious Denisovans. And still others, remaining in Africa, continued along the path that would eventually lead to us. Each of these human species represented a different solution to the challenge of survival in an increasingly complex world. The Neanderthals became masters of cold weather survival, developing powerful bodies and sophisticated hunting techniques that allowed them to thrive in Ice Age Europe. Recent discoveries have revealed that they were far more capable than once thought, hunting massive cave lions, creating complex tools, and developing what may have been the first forms of symbolic communication. The evidence from sites like Siegsdorf in Germany tells an extraordinary story. Neanderthal hunters didn't just scavenge the remains of cave lions that had died natural deaths. They actively hunted these apex predators, creatures that could kill a human with a single swipe of their massive paws. The cut marks on ancient bones reveal systematic butchering, suggesting that Neanderthals were not only brave enough to hunt these dangerous animals, but skilled enough to process them efficiently for food and materials. This wasn't desperate scavenging. This was sophisticated predation that required detailed knowledge of animal behavior, careful planning, and flawless execution. The Neanderthals had to track these solitary, nocturnal hunters across vast territories. They had to coordinate attacks that could bring down animals weighing several hundred pounds. They had to do all of this with wooden spears and stone tools, relying entirely on intelligence, courage, and teamwork. The Denisovans, meanwhile, were conducting their own evolutionary experiments in the mountains and forests of Asia. We know frustratingly little about them from fossils, just a handful of teeth and bone fragments from a cave in Siberia. But their genetic legacy tells a remarkable story of adaptation and survival in some of the world's most challenging environments. Unlike their African and European cousins, the Denisovans were dealing with extreme altitude, bitter cold, and landscapes that changed dramatically with the seasons. They evolved genetic adaptations that would prove crucial for later human populations. Innovations in metabolism, circulation, and oxygen processing that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would kill other humans. But the most remarkable discovery about these ancient human species wasn't their individual adaptations. It was what happened when they met each other. For hundreds of thousands of years, these different human populations had been evolving in isolation, developing their own unique characteristics and capabilities. When climate change and population pressure eventually brought them back into contact, something extraordinary occurred. And they didn't just compete or fight, though there was certainly conflict. They also interbred, creating hybrid offspring that combined the best traits of multiple human lineages. In a cave in Siberia, scientists discovered the remains of a teenage girl who lived 90,000 years ago. Genetic analysis revealed something unprecedented. Her mother was a Neanderthal, and her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid, living proof that these different human species were still genetically compatible, despite hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. This discovery shattered long-held assumptions about human evolution. For decades, scientists had imagined our ancestors as competitors, locked in a struggle for survival, with only the fittest lineage eventually prevailing. But the genetic evidence tells a different story entirely. It reveals a complex web of interaction, cooperation, and genetic exchange that continued right up until the present day. When modern humans finally emerged from Africa around 60,000 years ago, they didn't simply replace the archaic human populations they encountered. They interbred with them, incorporating Neanderthal and Denisovan genes into their own lineage. Today, most people outside of Africa carry genetic material from these ancient encounters, genetic gifts that have proven crucial for human survival and success. The Neanderthal genes in modern humans include variants that affect immune system function, helping us fight off diseases that our purely African ancestors had never encountered. Denisovan genes have proven even more valuable, providing adaptations for high-altitude living that allowed humans to colonize the Tibetan Plateau, and metabolic variants that helped Arctic populations survive in some of the world's most extreme environments. These ancient genetic contributions weren't just helpful, they were transformative. They allowed modern humans to rapidly adapt to environments across the globe without waiting for natural selection to provide the necessary mutations. Instead of taking thousands of generations to evolve cold weather adaptations, human populations could acquire them immediately through interbreeding with already adapted archaic humans. This genetic mixing had profound implications for human cognition as well. The larger brains of Neanderthals and Denisovans may have contributed to the explosive development of human creativity and symbolic thinking that occurred around 40,000 years ago. The cave paintings of Europe, the sophisticated tools of the Upper Paleolithic, the first musical instruments and jewelry, all of these innovations appeared in populations that carried significant amounts of archaic human DNA. The story of human evolution wasn't a simple progression from primitive to advanced, from ape-like ancestors to modern humans. It was a complex web of experimentation, adaptation, extinction, and hybridization that produced the most successful and adaptable species in the history of life on Earth. Each extinct human lineage contributed something essential to our success, whether through direct genetic contribution or through the competitive pressures that drove further innovation. By 40,000 years ago, this long evolutionary experiment was reaching a crescendo. The various human species that had populated the world for hundreds of thousands of years were converging into a single, highly successful lineage that combined the best traits of all its ancestors. The stage was set for the final transformation that would produce truly modern humans, beings capable not just of surviving in the world as they found it, but of fundamentally reshaping that world through the power of symbolic thought, language, and cumulative culture. The creatures that emerged from this evolutionary crucible were no longer simply another species of animal. They had become something unprecedented in the history of life, conscious agents capable of directing their own evolution through culture, technology, and deliberate choice. They had become us. Around 60,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened in a small corner of Africa. A group of modern humans, carrying within their genes the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of evolution, made a decision that would change the course of life on Earth forever. They looked beyond the familiar landscapes of their homeland and chose to walk into the unknown. This wasn't just migration anymore. This was the beginning of humanity's conscious conquest of the planet. Picture those first explorers standing at the edge of everything they had ever known. Behind them lay the savannas and forests where their ancestors had learned to walk upright, to make tools, to control fire, to think in ways no creature had ever thought before. Ahead lay vast deserts, towering mountains, frozen wastelands, and endless oceans. They had no maps, no knowledge of what waited beyond the horizon, but they had something more powerful than any navigation tool. They had curiosity, imagination, and the unshakable belief that whatever lay ahead, they could adapt to it. The journey out of Africa wasn't a single dramatic exodus. It was a gradual expansion that took thousands of years, with small groups pushing ever further into uncharted territory. They followed coastlines where shellfish provided reliable protein. They traced river valleys that offered fresh water and game. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated where food might be found, where shelter could be built, where danger might lurk. But this expansion was different from anything that had come before in the history of life. Previous migrations had been driven by environmental pressure or population growth. This movement was driven by something uniquely human, the desire to know what lay beyond the next hill, around the next bend, across the next body of water. They weren't fleeing from something. They were moving toward possibilities they could only imagine. As these early modern humans spread across the Middle East and into Asia, they encountered landscapes and challenges that would have stopped their ancestors cold. Deserts where water was scarce and temperatures could kill. Mountains where the air was too thin to breathe easily. Coastal regions where storms could arise without warning and sweep away everything in their path. But instead of turning back, they innovated. They learned to read the stars for navigation, creating the first mental maps of the night sky. They developed new hunting techniques suited to unfamiliar prey animals. They invented clothing and shelter designs that could protect them from weather patterns they had never experienced. Most remarkably, they began to develop different cultural solutions to similar environmental challenges, creating the first truly diverse human societies. In the harsh deserts of the Middle East, they became masters of water conservation and seasonal migration. In the dense forests of Southeast Asia, they learned to exploit resources from the forest floor to the canopy. In the grasslands of Central Asia, they developed nomadic lifestyles that allowed them to follow game animals across vast distances. Each environment demanded different skills, different tools, different ways of organizing social groups. But the most challenging frontier of all lay to the north, where Ice Age Europe stretched beneath glaciers that had persisted for thousands of years. Here, the modern humans encountered not just harsh climate, but competition from the Neanderthals who had already mastered survival in these frozen landscapes. The meeting between these two human species would prove to be one of the most consequential encounters in the history of our species. The Neanderthals weren't primitive cavemen waiting to be replaced by superior modern humans. They were sophisticated hunters and toolmakers who had survived in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They had larger brains than the modern humans, more powerful bodies, and intimate knowledge of European landscapes and animal behavior. By any reasonable measure, they should have easily outcompeted the newcomers from Africa. But the modern humans brought something different to this encounter. They had developed forms of symbolic communication that allowed them to coordinate activities on unprecedented scales. They could share complex information across generations through stories, songs, and artistic representations. They could plan not just for the immediate future, but for seasonal cycles and even longer-term environmental changes. Most importantly, they had learned to innovate collectively. While Neanderthal tool traditions remained relatively unchanged for thousands of years, modern human technology was evolving rapidly. New techniques spread quickly through populations. Innovations were modified and improved by each generation. Cultural evolution was beginning to outpace biological evolution as the primary driver of human adaptation. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of explosive creativity. The first cave paintings appeared, not just simple representations of animals, but sophisticated artistic compositions that required planning, preparation, and deep understanding of both artistic technique and the properties of pigments and surfaces. The artists who created these works weren't just documenting their world, they were interpreting it, transforming it into something that could communicate meaning across time and space. Musical instruments appeared in the archaeological record, bone flutes capable of producing complex melodies. These weren't crude noisemakers. They were precisely crafted tools for creating organized sound, suggesting that music and rhythm had become important parts of human social life. The capacity to create and appreciate beauty was emerging as a defining characteristic of modern human consciousness. Personal ornaments became common, shells and teeth and carved bone pieces that served no practical function except to mark identity, status, or group membership. For the first time, humans were using objects to communicate abstract concepts about themselves and their relationships to others. The symbolic mind was fully awakening, creating new possibilities for social organization and cultural complexity. But perhaps the most remarkable innovation of this period was the development of long-distance trade networks. Obsidian from volcanic sources hundreds of miles away began appearing in archaeological sites across Europe. Seashells from coastal areas were found in inland caves. Amber from northern forests made its way to southern settlements. Humans were no longer just adapting to their local environments, they were connecting distant regions through networks of exchange and communication. These trade networks weren't just about acquiring useful materials. They were about maintaining social connections across vast distances, sharing information about environmental conditions, coordinating group movements, and creating alliances that could provide support during times of crisis. The isolated bands of early humans were beginning to coalesce into something approaching civilization. Around 40,000 years ago, this explosion of cultural innovation reached a crescendo. The archaeological record from this period is so rich in artistic and technological achievements that archaeologists call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. But this wasn't really a revolution in the sense of sudden change. It was the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of gradual development in human cognitive abilities, finally reaching a threshold where symbolic thought could fully express itself. Language, that most human of all capabilities, was reaching its mature form. Humans could now communicate not just about immediate needs and dangers, but about abstract concepts, past events, future possibilities, and imaginary scenarios. They could share complex technical knowledge, coordinate elaborate group activities, and passed down cultural traditions that would persist for generations. The capacity for cumulative culture, the ability to build knowledge across generations, had finally emerged. This linguistic revolution transformed every aspect of human life. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated as hunters could share detailed information about animal behavior and coordinate complex group tactics. Tool-making techniques could be taught more efficiently, leading to rapid improvements in technology. Social relationships became more complex as humans could negotiate agreements, resolve conflicts, and maintain alliances through verbal communication rather than just physical interaction. But language did more than just improve practical activities. It opened up entirely new realms of human experience. Stories became possible, allowing humans to share experiences, transmit cultural values, and explore hypothetical scenarios. Abstract reasoning flourished as humans could manipulate concepts and relationships without physical objects. The capacity for philosophical thought, for wondering about the meaning and purpose of existence, was awakening. Religious and spiritual concepts began to appear in the archaeological record. Careful burial practices suggested beliefs about death and possible afterlife. Artistic representations included mysterious symbols and abstract designs that seemed to have carried spiritual or ceremonial significance. Humans were beginning to grapple with questions that went beyond immediate survival needs, wondering about their place in the cosmos and the meaning of their brief existence. The impact of these cognitive developments rippled through every aspect of human society. Group sizes increased as more sophisticated communication allowed for coordination of larger communities. Social hierarchies became more complex as individuals could specialize in different roles and activities. Territorial boundaries became more important as groups developed stronger cultural identities and more valuable accumulated resources to defend. Competition between human groups intensified, but so did cooperation. Alliances formed between distant communities. Information and resources flowed along trade networks that spanned continents. Cultural innovations spread rapidly from group to group, accelerating the pace of technological and social development. Humanity was becoming a truly interconnected species for the first time in its evolutionary history. As these cognitively modern humans continued to spread across the globe, they encountered environments that would have been completely uninhabitable to their ancestors. The frozen landscapes of northern Europe and Asia required innovations in clothing, shelter, and food preservation that pushed human ingenuity to its limits. The vast Pacific Ocean demanded seafaring technologies that could carry people safely across thousands of miles of open water to distant islands they couldn't even see from their starting points. Each new environment conquered represented not just geographical expansion, but cognitive and cultural evolution. Humans were learning to live in Arctic tundra and tropical rainforests, high mountains and low deserts, inland plains and ocean islands. No other species in the history of life had ever achieved such ecological versatility, and they were doing it not through biological adaptation, but through cultural innovation and behavioral flexibility. By 20,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, crossing significant stretches of open ocean in primitive boats. They had populated most of Europe and Asia, adapting to everything from Mediterranean climates to Siberian permafrost. They had developed dozens of distinct cultural traditions, each adapted to local conditions but connected to others through trade and communication networks that spanned continents. The stage was set for the final phase of human expansion, the colonization of the Americas, and the development of complex societies that would eventually give rise to agriculture, cities, and all the achievements and challenges of modern civilization. The long journey from tree-dwelling primates to global colonizers was nearing its climax. But the most dramatic chapters of human history were still to come. These early modern humans standing at the threshold of the New World carried within themselves the accumulated experience of millions of years of evolution. They were the products of countless experiments in survival, adaptation, and innovation. They possessed cognitive abilities that had never before existed on Earth, cultural capabilities that could transform environments faster than biological evolution could adapt to them, and social organizations that could coordinate activities across vast distances and timescales. They were no longer just another species struggling to survive in a hostile world. They had become conscious agents of change, capable of reshaping the planet itself through the power of imagination, cooperation, and relentless innovation. The age of human dominance was about to begin, and with it, both the greatest achievements and the greatest challenges our species had ever faced. The crossing into the Americas represents perhaps the most audacious chapter in humanity's conquest of the planet. Around 15,000 years ago, small bands of hunters stood at the edge of a frozen world, gazing across the Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia to an unknown continent. The Ice Age had locked up so much water in massive glaciers that sea levels had dropped, exposing a corridor of land between the continents. But this wasn't a gentle meadow waiting to be crossed. It was a harsh, windswept tundra where temperatures could kill and food was scarce. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing disaster. They were explorers, following game animals across landscapes that stretched beyond any horizon they had ever imagined. Mammoth herds moved in great migrations across this frozen bridge, and the humans followed, their entire lives organized around the rhythm of these massive creatures. They had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated where the herds would move next, how to predict their seasonal patterns, how to survive in their wake. The journey into the New World wasn't a single crossing. It was a gradual expansion that took thousands of years, with small groups pushing ever further into territory that had never known human footsteps. They moved through ice-free corridors between massive glaciers, following river valleys and mountain passes, always seeking the next valley, the next hunting ground, the next possibility for survival. What they found was a continent teeming with life unlike anything they had ever encountered. Giant ground sloths the size of elephants browsed in forests that stretched from horizon to horizon. Saber-toothed cats stalked prey through grasslands that had never heard human voices. Massive bison herds thundered across plains so vast they seemed to extend forever. This was a world where megafauna ruled, where creatures that would seem mythological to us were simply part of the daily reality of survival. The humans who entered this world brought with them technologies and strategies refined over thousands of years of hunting in the old world. But they also brought something more dangerous, an adaptability that could turn them into the most effective predators the Americas had ever seen. Within a remarkably short time, many of the continent's largest animals began to disappear from the fossil record. Mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers, enormous bears, all vanishing with a speed that suggests human hunting played a significant role in their extinction. This wasn't mindless slaughter. These early Americans were sophisticated hunters who understood animal behavior, migration patterns, and ecological relationships with remarkable precision. But they were also newcomers to these ecosystems, lacking the deep co-evolutionary relationship that had developed between predators and prey in other parts of the world. The megafauna of the Americas had never encountered human intelligence applied to hunting. They had no instinctive fear of these small, seemingly harmless bipeds who could coordinate attacks, plan ambushes, and kill from a distance with spear throwers and atlatls. The impact was revolutionary. For the first time in Earth's history, a single species was causing mass extinctions not through environmental catastrophe or climate change, but through conscious, deliberate action. Humans were becoming a geological force, capable of reshaping entire ecosystems within centuries rather than millennia. The age of human environmental impact had begun, though these early Americans had no way of understanding the long-term consequences of their success. As the great ice sheets retreated and sea levels rose, the land bridge to Asia was submerged, cutting off the Americas from the Old World. The human populations of the New World were now isolated, free to develop their own unique solutions to the challenges of survival and social organization. Over thousands of years, they diversified into hundreds of distinct cultures, each adapted to specific environments and ecological niches. In the Arctic, they became masters of ice and snow, developing technologies for hunting seals and whales that required unprecedented understanding of marine ecosystems and weather patterns. Their kayaks and umiaks were marvels of engineering, perfectly designed for navigating treacherous waters in pursuit of prey that could feed entire communities. They learned to read ice conditions with the precision of modern meteorologists, understanding how wind and current and temperature combined to create hunting opportunities or deadly hazards. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, they developed complex societies based on salmon runs and the rich resources of temperate rainforests. They built elaborate wooden structures, carved towering totem poles, and created artistic traditions that transformed functional objects into works of breathtaking beauty. Their understanding of forest ecology was so sophisticated that they could manage entire watersheds to maximize salmon productivity while maintaining the health of the broader ecosystem. On the Great Plains, they followed the buffalo herds in nomadic cycles that had been refined over centuries of trial and error. They developed portable technologies that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as they moved across vast distances. Their knowledge of animal behavior was so detailed that they could predict where herds would be weeks or months in advance, allowing them to coordinate the movements of entire tribes around these migrations. In the deserts of the Southwest, they learned to extract life from landscapes that seemed utterly barren to outsiders. They developed techniques for finding and conserving water that were so effective, they could support permanent settlements in areas that receive less than 10 inches of rainfall per year. Their understanding of plant ecology allowed them to cultivate crops in environments where agriculture should have been impossible. But perhaps the most remarkable development occurred in the tropical regions of Central and South America, where human societies began experimenting with intensive agriculture on a scale never before attempted. They didn't just plant crops, they transformed entire landscapes, creating raised fields, terraced hillsides, and complex irrigation systems that could support population densities rivaling those of modern cities. The development of agriculture represents one of the most profound transformations in human history. For millions of years, humans had been hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile groups that followed the rhythms of natural ecosystems. Agriculture changed everything. It allowed humans to create permanent settlements, to support much larger populations, and to free significant portions of society from the daily task of food procurement. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen in just one place. Around the world, human societies were independently discovering that they could manipulate plant and animal reproduction to create more reliable food supplies. In the Middle East, they were domesticating wheat and barley. In China, they were developing rice cultivation. In New Guinea, they were creating banana plantations. In the Andes, they were breeding potatoes and llamas. Each region developed its own unique agricultural systems based on local conditions and available species. The psychological impact of agriculture was as profound as its practical effects. For the first time, humans could plan not just for the next hunting season, but for the next year, the next decade, even the next generation. They could accumulate surpluses that provided security against bad harvests or unexpected disasters. They could support specialists, people whose entire lives were devoted to activities other than food production. Pottery appeared, allowing for better food storage and preparation. Metalworking developed, creating tools and weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. Weaving became sophisticated, producing textiles that could display complex patterns and artistic designs. Architecture evolved from simple shelters to elaborate structures that could serve ceremonial, defensive, or administrative functions. But perhaps most importantly, agriculture allowed for the development of complex social hierarchies and specialized roles. Chiefs and priests could emerge who were supported by the agricultural surplus of their communities. Warriors could train full-time for warfare rather than spending most of their energy hunting for food. Artisans could dedicate themselves to perfecting specialized crafts. Traders could travel long distances to exchange goods between different regions. The rise of complex societies brought new challenges that human intelligence had never before confronted. How do you organize and coordinate the activities of thousands of people? How do you resolve conflicts between individuals and groups with competing interests? How do you maintain social cohesion when people are no longer bound together by the immediate necessities of survival? How do you pass down accumulated knowledge and cultural traditions when societies become too large for everyone to know everyone else? The solutions that emerged were as varied as the societies that created them. Some cultures developed elaborate religious systems that provided moral frameworks for social behavior. Others created complex legal codes that specified punishments for different types of wrongdoing. Some societies were organized around kinship relationships that determined social roles and responsibilities. Others developed merit-based systems where individuals could advance through demonstrated ability or achievement. Writing systems began to appear, initially as simple record-keeping tools for tracking agricultural surpluses and trade transactions. But once humans could record information in permanent form, the possibilities for cultural development expanded exponentially. Laws could be written down and applied consistently. Historical events could be recorded for future generations. Complex philosophical and religious ideas could be preserved and transmitted across time and space. Mathematics developed to handle the computational challenges of large-scale agriculture, construction projects, and astronomical observation. Engineering advanced to support the infrastructure needs of growing cities. Medicine became more sophisticated as societies could support specialists who could devote their entire lives to understanding human health and disease. The pace of cultural evolution was accelerating at an unprecedented rate. Innovations that had once taken thousands of years to develop and spread were now being improved and modified within single generations. Human societies were becoming laboratories for social and technological experimentation on a scale never before seen in the history of life on Earth. Cities began to appear, dense concentrations of human activity that brought together people with diverse skills and knowledge. These weren't just large villages. They were qualitatively different forms of social organization that allowed for levels of specialization, coordination, and innovation that had never been possible before. In cities, a single individual could encounter more different ideas, technologies, and cultural practices in a single day than their hunter-gatherer ancestors might have experienced in a lifetime. The rise of urban civilization brought humanity to a new threshold. These weren't just successful animal populations anymore. They were conscious agents of change who could deliberately reshape their environment, their society, and even themselves through cultural innovation and collective action. They had developed technologies that could harness energy from wind and water. They had created architectural marvels that could last for centuries. They had established trade networks that connected distant continents. But perhaps most remarkably, they had begun to develop abstract thinking about the nature of reality itself. Philosophy emerged as humans began to ask fundamental questions about existence, morality, and the structure of the universe. Science began to develop as they created systematic methods for understanding natural phenomena. Art reached new levels of sophistication as societies could support individuals whose sole purpose was to create beauty and meaning. The stage was set for the final phase of human development, the emergence of technological civilization and the capacity to reshape not just local environments, but the entire planet. The journey from tree-dwelling primates to urban civilizations had taken millions of years, but the transformation was accelerating. Within just a few more millennia, humans would develop technologies that could send them beyond Earth itself, fulfilling the same drive for exploration that had carried their ancestors out of Africa and across every continent on the planet. The species that had begun as small, frightened creatures hiding in the trees had become the dominant force on Earth, capable of achievements that would have seemed magical to their ancestors. But they had also inherited all the challenges that come with such power. The responsibility to use their capabilities wisely and the constant danger that their success might ultimately lead to their destruction. The story of human evolution had brought them to the threshold of a new kind of existence, one where the choices they made would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of countless other species and the health of the planet itself. The emergence of written language represents perhaps the most profound leap in human consciousness since the development of speech itself. Around 5,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, humans began scratching symbols into clay tablets that could preserve thoughts beyond the fragility of memory. These weren't just pictures or simple records. They were the first attempts to capture the full complexity of human thought in permanent form. Picture the revolutionary moment when someone realized they could encode not just concrete objects, but abstract concepts, emotions, and complex relationships between ideas. The cuneiform scribes of ancient Sumer weren't just keeping track of grain supplies or trade transactions. They were creating literature, preserving laws, recording history, and exploring philosophical questions that still occupy human minds today. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest literary works, grappled with themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning that resonate across millennia. Writing transformed human memory from something individual and temporary into something collective and eternal. Knowledge could now accumulate across generations in ways that had never been possible before. A scholar in ancient Egypt could read the thoughts of someone who had died centuries earlier. Mathematical discoveries made in Babylon could be preserved and built upon by thinkers in distant lands and future ages. But the impact went far beyond practical applications. Writing was changing the structure of human consciousness itself. When thoughts had to be organized into written form, they became more precise, more logical, more systematic. The act of writing forced people to think about thinking, to analyze their own mental processes in ways that had never been necessary before. Abstract reasoning flourished as humans could manipulate complex ideas through symbols rather than just through direct experience. Legal systems became more sophisticated as laws could be written down, debated, and applied consistently across large populations. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't just a collection of punishments. It was an attempt to create a rational, predictable framework for social behavior that could govern the interactions of thousands of people who would never meet face to face. Justice was becoming systematic rather than arbitrary. Religious thinking evolved as well, moving beyond simple ritual and storytelling toward complex theological systems that could address sophisticated questions about the nature of divinity, morality, and human purpose. The written scriptures that emerged in various cultures weren't just preservation of oral traditions. They were new forms of religious thought that could explore paradox, contradiction, and nuance in ways that spoken language alone could never achieve. Mathematics exploded into new realms of abstraction. Numbers stopped being just tools for counting sheep or measuring grain. They became objects of investigation in their own right. Mathematicians began discovering patterns and relationships that existed purely in the realm of abstract thought. Geometry developed not just as a practical tool for building and surveying, but as an exploration of perfect forms that existed only in the mind. The pace of technological innovation accelerated dramatically as knowledge could be preserved and shared more effectively. Engineering techniques developed in one generation could be recorded, studied, and improved by the next. Architectural knowledge accumulated, allowing for the construction of increasingly ambitious projects that required coordination across decades of planning and building. Trade networks became more complex as written contracts could specify detailed terms of agreement between parties who spoke different languages and lived in different cultures. Currency developed as abstract representations of value that could facilitate exchange across vast distances and time periods. Economic thinking began to emerge as humans grappled with questions about value scarcity, and the distribution of resources. But perhaps the most profound change was in how humans understood themselves. For the first time, individuals could record their own thoughts and experiences for posterity. Autobiography became possible. Personal reflection could be preserved and shared. The sense of individual identity was strengthening as people could see their own thoughts reflected back to them in written form. Historical consciousness emerged as humans began to understand themselves as part of a continuous story that stretched back through time. They could read about the deeds of ancient kings, the rise and fall of civilizations, the lessons of past successes and failures. The present moment was no longer isolated, but connected to a vast narrative of human experience. Science began to develop as systematic methods for understanding natural phenomena. Early astronomers in Babylon and Egypt weren't just tracking celestial movements for practical purposes like agriculture and navigation. They were beginning to discover mathematical patterns in the cosmos that suggested underlying laws governing natural phenomena. The idea that the universe might operate according to comprehensible principles was taking root. And here we are, you and I, sitting together across time and space, the latest chapter in this extraordinary story that began with small creatures in ancient trees. Every neuron firing in your brain, every word you understand, every emotion you feel, carries within it the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of evolution. You are the direct descendant of survivors who walked upright for the first time, who controlled fire, who painted on cave walls, who crossed frozen continents to explore unknown worlds. The journey from those first primates to the person listening to these words represents the most remarkable transformation in the history of life on Earth. We've become the first species capable of understanding our own origins, of looking back across deep time and seeing the thread that connects us to every creature that came before. We've developed the ability to leave our home planet, to peer into the cosmos, to ask questions about existence itself. But with that extraordinary power comes extraordinary responsibility. We are no longer just another species struggling to survive. We are conscious agents capable of shaping the future of life on Earth. The same drive that carried our ancestors out of Africa and across every continent now faces its greatest challenge, learning to use our capabilities wisely to ensure that this incredible story continues for generations yet to come. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that you carry within yourself the dreams and struggles of countless ancestors who never gave up, who always kept moving forward, who always believed that tomorrow could be better than today. Their story is your story. Their journey is your inheritance. And their hope lives on in every choice you make.